The pen is mightier than the sword. It's a well-worn expression, and its meaning, that words are more powerful than weapons, goes all the way back to ancient Mesopotamia. But that exact phrasing, the pen is mightier than the sword, is attributed to 19th century British novelist and playwright Edward Bulwer Lytton, who penned that phrase in a book he published in 1839, which is perfect for tonight's story, a real-life mystery that takes place in a tiny English town, like the kind that we Americans only see with a BritBox subscription, like something out of Agatha Christie or Agatha Raisin. A small village with lush green grass and free-roaming sheep, a tiny village center with church bells and birds, maybe a vicar on a bicycle. Let's add one. There we go. Now about that pen. What's important to note, back when that book was written in the 1800s, that the sentence about the pen being mightier than the sword was meant to be about protection and self-defense. That a man's life was threatened and he couldn't use a weapon, didn't have a sword. But that was okay, because he learns that sharp words can cut the power of an enemy better than the keenest blade. The difference between that and the man at the center of this story, well, assuming it was a man, but we'll get to that later. His words were drawn from a poison pen that he used as a weapon of mass destruction, unleashed on an unsuspecting village. In these letters, they were like the Agent Orange of poison pen letters, a strategic campaign to dust and destroy an entire town and just about everyone in it. But how could the words of one person, scrawled on a series of letters, threaten an entire town? Well, we'll get to all that and much more in this true story, which I tracked down after reading a chilling short story by Shirley Jackson, one that was turned into a bedtime story in the previous episode of this podcast. And if you haven't heard that episode yet, that's okay. You can enjoy this one, and if you're still awake at the end, you can jump back and listen to the previous episode to help you fall asleep. I'm Nancy Miller, and this is Dead Sleep, True Crime for Bedtime, the only true crime podcast made for uninterrupted nighttime listening. No loud, obnoxious ads, no horrific depictions of torture or 911 calls, just real-life mysteries told mindfully to help you fall asleep. So with that, let's imagine ourselves back in that English country village where it's chilly outside, but so cozy in bed. And we close our eyes. Oh wait, let's add a cat. You want to add a cat? Let's add a cat. Okay, now we're joined by a happy, purring, sleeping cat curled up next to us. It's an imaginary cat. Don't worry about allergies. Now we can close our eyes and fall dead asleep with Dead Sleep, True Crime for Bedtime. And a story drawn from real-life events that took place in England in the 80s and 90s and early 2000s. A saga that continued right up until 2017 that I'm calling The Nerd. Okay, so you've heard of a whodunit and a whydunit. This is a what did it? What was the inciting incident? What was the thing that started it all? Well, it's hard to say for sure, but I think most can agree it started with the house. A cottage, really. One of those cozy brick bungalows that are covered in ivy, overlooking a beautiful, vast, soothing meadow. Seems so peaceful from the outside, but on the inside, an old woman named Molly Christian was anything but relaxed. She sat, tensed, in her living room, waiting for the bomb to drop. Molly was in her 70s when all of this first started. She was born around 1911, which meant she'd seen 2 wars, World War I and World War II. She'd survived the bombing blitz when the Nazis flew over England and tried to decimate an entire population, one bomb at a time. But believe it or not, this bomb was scarier. It was closer to home. As close to home as it could get. The bomb was headed down Mrs. Christian's chimney. The letter said it was coming. That bomb, straight down her chimney. What for and why, she didn't know. All that she knew was that this was one of a handful of letters she'd received recently, written in colorful ink, some of the letters stenciled to mask the handwriting. And it told her that a bomb was going to go straight down her chimney. A dark threat, crudely rendered in multicolored, felt-tipped magic marker. At first it seemed like a prank, a terrible one, because Molly Christian had never hurt anyone. Who would want to bomb her house? Who would send such a thing? This wasn't wartime. This was the late 1980s, when England dominated popular culture, including Rick Astley, who was everywhere on the radio, everywhere in the world, promising he was never going to give you up. Back here in Mansfield, where Mrs. Christian lived, she was ready to pack it in. She'd been trying to sell her cottage for several months, and now she sensed a particular urgency. The letters scared Molly enough that she'd contacted the local authorities. The town of Mansfield was so small, a village, technically, it wouldn't be hard to find their suspect. And it wasn't. Authorities made quick work of it, and they had their man in custody. Well, man isn't quite right. He was a boy, an 11-year-old. And for the sake of his privacy in this story, it being a small town, I'm changing his name and a few other names. So I'm going to call him the most British name I can think of, Rupert Ian Smith. Rupert swore he hadn't done it, and his mother, Mrs. Smith, she believed him, but the police didn't. The letters written to Molly Christian had a distinctly childlike appearance, and the threats were the kind of absurd hyperbole a child might come up with, one who wanted attention. In those early letters, they also had a juvenile signature. At the end of the letter, it was signed from the nerd. And for a moment, it seemed like this was it. An open and shut case. A dumb kid who played a dumb prank. But it wouldn't prove that simple. Because Rupert had an alibi. Rupert was on a school ski trip in Switzerland. Wasn't even in the country when these threatening letters were sent. And these letters, they were sent locally. There was no way that Rupert could have done this. Their suspect, this nerd, was still out there. Which took this case to a whole new level. Because a bomb threat from a child is one thing. A bomb threat from an adult was a whole other matter, and one that was terrifying to think about. Here in the United States, chief explosive scientists at the FBI laboratory in Quantico have studied bombers their threats, and their motivations for decades. And despite the myriad variables in each case, the FBI has distilled years of it all down to 3 motivating factors. The 3 factors that instigate most bombings, according to the FBI, are 1. Power disparity. 2. Malice. That means evil intent. And 3. Mental illness. And those factors, they overlap like a Venn diagram. It could be at least 2 or 3 at the same time. According to the FBI, many bombings occur when perpetrators feel something critical to their sense of being is under threat. Religious beliefs, ethnic identities are often a prime example of an action that would trigger a bomb maker. Anarchists refer to dynamite as the great equalizer because of its ability to empower the person against a daunting foe, be it a governmental or industrial power. The most obvious example of this here in the U.S. was the Unabomber, Ted Kaczynski, who sent deadly bombs through the mail from the late 70s until the mid-90s, ultimately killing 3 people and injuring 23 others. In the case of Ted Kaczynski, he saw himself as an underdog, a hero, David fighting against the Goliath of the evils of technology and the industrial age. But this was Manfield, a town of a couple hundred people. And the letters that were threatening Molly Christian, they were just letters. There certainly wasn't anyone who stood out as the next Ted Kaczynski, or it didn't seem that way. Was it possible there was really some Manfield mini Unabomber in their midst? Again, this was a small village. If it were someone in the town, and authorities were pretty sure it was someone in the town, it meant that they were hiding in plain sight. That much they knew. What they didn't know was where and how and who this nerd was going to strike next. They wouldn't have to wait too long. Soon after the young boy Rupert Smith was cleared of all charges, his parents started to receive threatening letters. And these letters added a whole new twist to this case. Because one of those letters wasn't a bomb threat, but it dropped a different kind of bombshell. One of the letters addressed to Rupert's father claimed Rupert's mother was having an affair. An accusation that Rupert's mother vehemently denied. Fortunately, Rupert's father believed Rupert's mother when she said that wasn't true. But then came more letters to other neighbors of Mrs. Molly Christian, including a kindly professor named James Forster, who apparently received 2 letters from this nerd. And one of those letters threatened to put a bomb under his wife's car. The letters, it seemed, were like a social virus, with Mrs. Molly Christian as patient 0. Whoever had been in contact with Molly received letters, and then the people in the town connected to those people, they received letters. And these letters were different than those bomb threats. They were personal attacks about someone's moral fiber, their character, like infidelity. Which suddenly changed the game, suggesting perhaps the letter writer wasn't a man after all, like some mini Unabomber with a manifesto, but someone who felt morally superior to their fellow townsfolk, but for whatever reason wasn't able to say these things directly to those people, which might suggest that this letter writer was a woman. You'll remember from the previous episode, the woman at the center of the story is Miss Strangeworth, a pillar in her community, who secretly and darkly judges her neighbors and considers it her job in the town to correct immoral behavior, the wickedness. Even if that means fabricating lies to keep everyone in line. This behavior fits the historical narrative of one archetypal poison pen writer. When in the early 20th century, there was a sharp increase of poison pen letters, anonymous letters believed to be written by women. The rise of the poison pen letter is connected to the rise in education of women. By the early 1900s, at least in the United States, women were nearly on the same literacy level as men, but they still didn't have the rights or personal power that men had. So they expressed their frustration, feeling trapped in their lives, by writing anonymous letters, these poison pen letters. The term poison pen to describe an anonymous letter that's filled with malicious gossip actually started in 1911, first published in a Maryland newspaper. And one of the biggest cases of poison pen letters written by women happened in 1915. In this creepy and high-profile case that happened in New York, a group of young society women began receiving poison pen letters, all of them written on hotel stationery and sent locally. These young ladies were all different, but they did have one thing in common. These girls were all engaged to be married, and these poison pen letters attempted to bring distress to the brides-to-be by questioning their virtue, and thereby threatening their reputation. Those letters were eventually traced back to 3 women. In the New York Times headline, when the case was covered, the women are described as 3 insane women, because 2 of the women were confined as inmates at the Middletown State Hospital for the Insane, and the 3rd woman, a former inmate, was believed to be their accomplice on the outside. These women apparently chose their victims through the society pages, the engagement announcements in the newspaper, and I don't know what happened when these women were caught. But this profile of a mad or lonely, spiteful woman out to destroy another woman's reputation would become a familiar scenario, especially with gossip. And the threat of hurting someone's reputation in a tight-knit community like Manfield, reputation was more important than money. Reputation was critical to keeping social order, a civilized society. Tear at that delicate fabric, and well, all hell breaks loose. And there was one woman who fit the profile to a T. Could this possibly be an inside job? Molly Christian fit the Strangeworth profile. An older woman who lived alone, who maybe felt superior, who maybe felt isolated or overlooked. And she was in her late 20s when the term poison pen was first popularized in Great Britain back in the 1930s. But if there were any suspicions around Molly Christian, they would soon be disproven, because whoever this was had escalated. And that's when things went from unsettling to terrifying. One day, the elderly Molly Christian returned home to her cottage and noticed that she couldn't open her front door. This was a tiny village. You could just leave home without even carrying a key and know you were safe. But now here at Molly's house, well, her door wouldn't open. And upon further inspection, it was clear why. Someone had glued all of the outside locks shut so she couldn't get into her own house. Whoever this was, they'd been to her house, somehow knew her routine to know when she wasn't going to be there, and then vandalized her home. After years of letters, and now the target of an actual physical harassment campaign on her property, Molly Christian was ready. to move on. Her house was already for sale. She'd nearly sold it to her neighbor, James Forster, but then when that deal fell through, she was likely relieved when she found another buyer. A family. Maybe. Whoever had this fixation on Molly and her close community of neighbors and friends would move on. A new family meant a fresh start. But for the nerd, it meant a whole new set of victims. In Manfield, there was one of everything. One pub, one church, and now one serial menace. A singular, strange predator. One who was obsessed with the town of Manfield and determined to mess up the lives of everyone in it. Over the span of more than a decade, in a town of 86 households, more than 60 of those households had received a letter from the nerd. It had started with Molly Christian, then the parents of the child Rupert, who was their first suspect, along with her neighbor James Forster, that it spread out to others. And then boomeranged back to Molly Christian's former house, where a new family lived. And this time, it was the teenage daughter who lived in the house who was the target. The nerd wrote about the teenage girl's promiscuity and sent her vulgar postcards addressed to her and her family, accusing her of prostitution. Authorities tried their best with the tools they had, but well, this nerd knew how to cover tracks. Whoever it was wore gloves, no fingerprints, and sealed the stamp with water, not saliva, so there were no biological samples to work with. The years went by, and by 1998, that's roughly 10 years since this whole campaign started, this nerd had gone from letter writing to vandalism to what seemed like physical threats and destruction of property all over town. People found their cars damaged, tires slashed. The family who now lived in Molly Christian's old house had their garden torn up, paintballs aimed at their house, and acid poured on their car. One resident who ultimately moved away because of the harassment said that it was like living a double life, that things seemed like normal on the surface, but underneath it all, everyone was suspicious, paranoid, questioning, even turning on each other. A father of 4 who took care of his chronically ill wife was accused of being a flasher and a sexual predator. And even though he knew it wasn't true, the shame of having someone write that in a letter, and the uncertainty of not knowing who it was, and wondering who could think that about you, it messed with his head and he went into a deep depression. Now, online harassment happens all the time. Trolls and hurtful online comments, we've all received those. But there was something about a letter and the intimacy of getting a piece of paper in the mail. Well, you couldn't delete it. It was right there in your hand. No one in the entire town seemed capable of meeting the nerd's high moral standards. Even the vicar in the town parish received a poison pen letter criticizing the vicar because he had officiated a wedding ceremony between 2 people and one of them had been divorced. And that's how these letters divided a community, because you didn't know who you could trust. And after all these years, it seemed like this person was never going to get caught. Until one day, the nerd sent a letter to the wrong man. This man's name was Eric Collin, and he was the coordinator of Manfield's Neighborhood Watch Committee. A neighborhood watch that had been on high alert for years, trying to track down the nerd. Eric was savvy about security, and one day he even helped the family, the one who had lived in Molly's house, install a security system. Maybe they could catch this nerd in the act. And it was days after he'd helped with that security system that Eric started receiving poison pen letters. And these letters accused him of spying on his neighbors and reporting them to the police. This nerd also decided to make Eric a public target, circulating flyers all around the neighborhood, accusing Eric of being the poison pen writer himself. And then one night, when he was on patrol, walking around the neighborhood, he stumbled upon a familiar face. A man they called the Dotty Professor, Professor James Forster. Professor Forster was a man in his 60s, with a wife and children and grandchildren, even great-grandchildren. What was James Forster doing out so late? When confronted, Professor Forster said he was out late at night so he could see the moons of Jupiter. For what it's worth, Jupiter has over 90 moons, and 4 moons, called the Galilean moons, might be visible, but not likely without very strong binoculars or a telescope. Whatever the case, the neighbors weren't buying it. Eric and a few other neighbors began to put the puzzle pieces together. James Forster was Molly Christian's next-door neighbor. James Forster had actually made an offer on Molly Christian's cottage, and apparently, for whatever reason, the deal fell through. But could it be he was so upset with Molly Christian that he would send her bomb threats? And that he continued to be so angry about it that he'd threaten the new family? Was he capable of doing all of these things? They weren't sure. But he was the only one they could think of who had a motive, their only reasonable suspect. Eric and a few other neighbors began to believe that this James Forster, this seemingly kind and sweet professor, a man who'd worked for the church parish for years, was their nerd. But when they went to the media and to the police to share their suspicions, something unexpected happened. The one who got in trouble wasn't the professor. People turned on those who'd made the accusations. Because how dare they accuse James Forster? He was a crucial part of the community, and he looked the part. Gray-haired with Coke bottle glasses, always riding around town on his bicycle, wearing a tweed blazer and a wool cap. It was like accusing your grandfather of being the mastermind of one of the longest, strangest, ickiest harassment campaigns ever. There was no way. But by 1999, the police had started to wonder if maybe Eric and some of these neighbors were right. They didn't have anything substantial on James Forster. Again, there was no biological material on the letters. There was not a single lick of a stamp or fingerprints. But over the course of 3 years, they kept an eye on James Forster, waiting for the nerd to make a mistake, to get sloppy, to act stupid. And finally, one day, he did. It was now 1999, when one day, a 13-year-old girl, the daughter of a woman who was the parish council clerk in Manfield, received a package in the mail. The item was a pornographic magazine called Parade. And with the magazine was a stenciled note. And the note read, "A gift from Manfield. Sending bomb threats to an old lady, then accusing nearly all of your neighbors of being thieves, flashers, sexual predators, prostitutes, and then the attempt to pin it on someone else." That was all pretty bad. But choosing to send a child a hardcore pornographic magazine with a note on a scrap of paper, well, that crossed the line. That really was the point of no return. And that piece of paper turned out to be the clue authorities needed to crack this case. At 7:30 in the morning in November of 1999, North Yorkshire police knocked on Professor James Forster's door. The professor and his wife had lived in Manfield for nearly 30 years, and he'd recently retired with plans to spend time with his family, his children, his grandchildren, and now great-grandchildren. And by all accounts, he'd never had a crossword with anyone until that day. With the police at his door, he coldly asked how long this was going to take. And then he let them in. Then sat down to eat his breakfast of porridge and snidely said to the police, "You're not going to find any evidence here." The authorities raided Dr. Forster's home, looking quite literally for a shred of evidence. That sheet of paper that matched the scrap of paper found inside the porn magazine sent to that 13-year-old girl, the one that read, "A gift from Manfield." And believe it or not, bingo. They found a ripped piece of paper that was the exact match for the note sent to the girl. And then there were the magic markers and the stencils that Dr. Forster swore were for his great-grandchildren, but they matched the ones that were used in all of the nerd letters. They also found in Dr. Forster's home a pair of latex gloves, presumably used by the nerd to not leave fingerprints. There was also a diary, which chronicled the daily movements of a lot of people in town, including Eric Collin from the Neighborhood Watch, with an obsessive focus on the family that lived in Molly Christian's old house. James Forster was arrested and taken into custody. He'd eventually go to trial, and the case would make headlines. There were a lot of charges. The trial took 8 days. And it seemed at the trial his true colors came out. He was angry, snobbish, rude, and at one point told the judge that the judge knew nothing about science. Ultimately, a jury took 4 hours to find James Forster guilty of several charges, including 3 charges of indecent mail and 3 of threatening to damage property. At the age of 68, James Forster, who protested that he was innocent, was sentenced to 4 months in jail. The motive was never quite clear, but detectives said that they believed that James Forster saw himself as high up in society and seemed to think that everyone, from the police to the people in the town, were just thick plods. They described him as a very, very strange man. Intelligent, but devious. And he was a man who held grudges. And apparently his resentments went further back than anyone knew. The grudge started with the house. Even before Molly sold it, James Forster had decided that he wanted that house and was trying to scare Molly into leaving. Then when she sold it to someone else, things escalated further. And as the years passed, he kept going and sprawling, and his tentacles of resentment and anger and control reached out to 60 or more houses of the 86 households in Manfield. But here's the part that I find the most strange. After James Forster served his time, and he was released from prison, he went back to Manfield, back to his old life with his wife, back to where he knew everyone, and everyone knew him, and knew what he did. And he managed to live there without incident until he died in his 80s in 2017. And up until the very end, the town was divided. People who just couldn't square the public face of James Forster with the dark specter of the nerd. James Forster could have been known for a lot of things. as a brilliant professor, as a kindly neighbor, as a friend of the church. But instead he'll be remembered as a nerd. Well, not a nerd, as the nerd. The meanest, angriest, most vindictive nerd that ever lived. Or at least that ever lived in Manfield. At least, for now. Thank you for listening to Dead Sleep True Crime for Bedtime. As always, there is a lot more to this story. So I encourage you to check out the links of the sources that I used for this story in the show notes. I'll be back next week with a new episode. And until then, nighty-night.